The stars looked cold and distant through the windows of the UES horizon as it moved away from the Zephyrian home system. Captain Jake Harrison sat in his command chair and felt the weight of failure pressing down on his shoulders. 3 months of talks with the Zephyrian Empire had ended with nothing but harsh words and threats. The aliens had made it clear that they saw humans as inferior beings who should be grateful for any scraps of territory they were allowed to keep. Pete Morgan wiped the sweat from his forehead as he worked in the engine room. The young engineer had been fixing the same power coupling for the past hour, but his mind kept wandering to the negotiations. He had listened to the recordings and felt sick at how the Zephyrians spoke about other species. They called humans dirt crawlers and suggested that the galaxy would be better off if humanity simply disappeared. The worst part was how some of the human diplomats had just sat there and taken the insults without fighting back. Dr. Lisa Carter walked through the medical bay, checking her supplies. She had hoped they would need medical gear for setting up aid stations on new colony worlds. Instead, she packed everything away, knowing that war might be coming soon. The Zephyrians had made their position clear. They wanted to expand their empire, and they did not care who stood in their way. She thought about her daughter back on Earth and wondered if she would ever see her again. Commander Ryan Brooks stood at the security station reviewing threat reports. The Zephyrian military was 3 times larger than the human fleet, and their technology was more advanced. If fighting started, humanity would be in serious trouble. He had recommended that Earth begin preparing defenses immediately, but the politicians wanted to try more. Diplomatic talks first. Brooks knew that was just wasting time, that they did not have Lieutenant Amy Walsh sat at her communications console monitoring space traffic. The Zephyrian ships had been following them since they left the home system. She counted at least 6 vessels keeping pace with the horizon. They were not trying to hide their presence, which made the message clear. The humans were being watched, and they better not try anything stupid. Amy felt angry at being treated like criminals when all they had done was ask for peace. The bridge was quiet, except for the soft hum of the ship's systems. Captain Harrison stared at the star charts and tried to figure out what to tell Earth Command. The Zephyrians had rejected every compromise and seemed to want total surrender. They spoke about other species like they were animals that needed to be tamed or destroyed. Harrison had served in the military for 20 years, but he had never faced an enemy that seemed so completely without mercy. Pete finished his repairs and headed to the observation deck. He liked to look at the stars when he needed to think. His grandfather had fought in Earth's last war and always said that sometimes good people had to stand up to bullies even when the odds were bad. Pete wondered if humans would have the courage to fight if the Zephyrians attacked. Many people on Earth just wanted to avoid trouble and hoped the aliens would leave them alone. The proximity alarm suddenly started beeping on the bridge. Lieutenant Walsh quickly ran a scan and found something unexpected. A small escape pod was drifting in space about 10,000 kilometers away. The pod was sending out a distress signal, but it was not human technology. The design looked Zephyrian, but the signal was weak and getting weaker. Captain Harrison called the senior staff to the bridge. Dr. Carter arrived first, followed by Commander Brooks and Pete Morgan. Lieutenant Walsh played the distress signal through the speakers. The voice was speaking in the Zephyrian language, but the universal translator made the words clear. Someone was badly hurt and asking for help. The life support systems in the pod were failing. Commander Brooks shook his head when he heard the translation. He pointed out that this could be a trap. The Zephyrians might be testing to see if humans would help their enemies, or if they would just leave them to die. He recommended that they ignore the signal and continue on their course. Getting involved with Zephyrian internal affairs would only cause more problems. Dr. Carter disagreed strongly. She said that her medical oath required her to help anyone who was injured regardless of their species. The person in the pod would die if they did not act quickly. She could not live with herself if she let someone die when she had the power to save them. Her job was to preserve life, not to play political games. Pete looked at the scanner readings and saw that the pod had been drifting for several hours. Whoever was inside had been fighting to stay alive for a long time. He thought about what his grandfather would say about leaving someone to die in the cold emptiness of space. Some things were more important than politics, and saving a life was one of them. Captain Harrison made the decision to bring the pod aboard. He ordered Commander Brooks to prepare a security team in case this was some kind of trick. Dr. Carter rushed to the medical bay to get ready for emergency treatment. Pete and Lieutenant Walsh worked together to bring the pod into the cargo bay using the ship's tractor beam. When they opened the escape pod, they found a young Zephyrian female inside. Her blue skin was pale, and her normally bright bioluminescent markings were dim with exhaustion. She wore the remains of what looked like royal clothing, but it was torn and stained with strange colored blood. Dr. Carter immediately began treating her injuries while the others watched in amazement. The alien was unconscious, but she kept mumbling words in her sleep. Lieutenant Walsh recorded everything and ran it through the translator. The words painted a picture of violence and betrayal. She spoke about her people suffering under a cruel father and how she had tried to help them find freedom. She mentioned concentration camps and mass executions of innocent civilians who had only wanted basic rights. Pete felt something stir in his chest as he listened to the translations. This was not just any Zephyrian. This was someone who had risked everything to fight against the same evil empire that threatened humanity. She had given up a life of comfort and safety to stand up for what was right. Now she was alone and dying, while everyone who should have helped her had turned away. Dr. Carter worked for 3 hours to stabilize the alien's condition. When she finally stepped back, she announced that the patient would live, but needed several days of rest to recover fully. She also mentioned that the injuries looked like they came from Zephyrian weapons. Someone from her own species had tried to kill her as the medical team moved the unconscious alien to a private room. Pete made a decision that would change everything. He would make sure this brave soul got the help she deserved no matter what anyone else said. Sometimes doing the right thing meant standing alone against the whole world. The message from the Galactic Council arrived 18 hours after they had rescued the alien princess. Captain Harrison read it 3 times before calling his senior staff to the briefing room. The words were simple and direct. The human ship was harboring a known terrorist named Princess Kiravel, who had committed crimes against the Zephyrian Empire. They had 48 hours to surrender her or face immediate military action from a combined fleet. Pete Morgan sat in the back of the briefing room and watched his crewmates discuss what to do. Commander Brooks stood at the front, showing tactical displays of the Zephyrian battle fleet that was already moving toward their position. The enemy had 12 heavy cruisers and twice that many smaller ships. The U.S. Horizon was just one diplomatic vessel with light weapons and weak shields. Dr. Carter spoke first about the patient's condition. Princess Kiravel had regained consciousness, but was still very weak from her injuries. She had burns from energy weapons and several broken bones that would take weeks to heal properly. Moving her now could kill her, but keeping her aboard might kill everyone else. The doctor's voice shook as she described having to choose between her patient and her crewmates. Lieutenant Walsh presented the intelligence they had gathered about the princess. She was the youngest daughter of Emperor Zexkun, who ruled the Thunsishir Zephyrian Empire with absolute power. 3 months ago, she had led a rebellion against her father's government, trying to free lower caste aliens who were being used as slaves. The rebellion had failed, and most of her followers had been executed. She had barely escaped with her life. The ship's AI system, called Oracle, projected the crew's chances of survival if they kept the princess aboard. The mechanical voice announced that their odds were less than 12%. If they surrendered her immediately, their chances improved to 67%. The AI recommended compliance with the Council's demands based on pure mathematical logic. Commander Brooks slammed his hand on the table and pointed out the obvious facts. One person's life was not worth risking the entire human race. If they started a war with the Zephyrian Empire, billions of people on Earth would die. The princess had made her choices, and now she had to face the consequences. It was not their job to save every rebel who fought against their government. Pete stood up slowly and felt all eyes turned toward him. He was the youngest person in the room and the lowest-ranking officer, but he could not stay quiet. He reminded everyone that the princess had been fighting against the same evil empire that wanted to destroy humanity. She had risked everything to protect innocent people from slavery and murder. How could they hand her over to the monsters who would torture her to death? Dr. Carter nodded and said she agreed with Pete's moral argument, but they had to think about practical reality. The Zephyrians would not just kill the princess quickly. They would make her suffer for months as an example to other potential rebels. But if the crew tried to protect her, the Zephyrians would kill everyone aboard the ship and then attack Earth anyway. Sometimes good people had to make terrible choices. Lieutenant Walsh pulled up recordings of the princess talking in her sleep. The translator had decoded more of her words during the night. She spoke about concentration camps where millions of lower-caste aliens were worked to death. She described seeing children as young as 5 years old being shot for stealing food. She mentioned a secret plan by her father to release a virus that would kill every human in the galaxy. The room fell silent as they listened to the translations. Pete felt sick thinking about the horrors the princess had witnessed. She had grown up in a palace surrounded by luxury, but she chose to fight against her own family when she learned the truth about their crimes. How many people would have that kind of courage when everything they had ever known was built on lies and violence? Captain Harrison looked tired and older than his 50 years. He had joined the space service to explore new worlds and meet alien civilizations. Instead, he found himself caught between saving one brave soul and protecting his entire species. The politicians back on Earth would never forgive him if he started a war over one alien refugee, no matter how noble her cause might. Commander Brooks brought up tactical options for fighting their way out of the system. The Horizon could probably outrun some of the enemy ships, but not all of them. They might be able to reach a neutral system before being caught, but that would just delay the inevitable. The Zephyrians would keep hunting them until they were all dead or captured. Pete asked to speak with the princess directly. Dr. Carter said she was awake, but still very weak from her injuries. Captain Harrison agreed to let Pete visit her for a few minutes while they continued planning. Commander Brooks objected, but the captain overruled him. Maybe talking to the alien would help them understand what they were really dealing with. Medical Bay was quiet, except for the soft beeping of monitoring equipment. Princess Kiravel, small and fragile, lying in the hospital bed. Her blue skin was still pale, but her bioluminescent markings were starting to glow more brightly as she recovered. When Pete entered the room, she turned her large golden eyes toward him and tried to smile. Pete introduced himself and explained that the crew was trying to decide what to do. The princess listened carefully and then spoke in heavily accented but clear human language. She had learned to speak several alien languages, including human English, during her time working with refugees and rebels. Her voice was soft but strong. With determination, she told Pete about her childhood friend named Zira Lynn, who belonged to a lower caste family. They had played together as children until Kiravel learned that such friendships were forbidden by law. When she was older, she discovered that Zaralyn had been executed for teaching lower caste children how to read. That was when she realized her father's empire was built on cruelty and had to be stopped. The princess described the rebellion she had led and how it had failed when someone betrayed their plans to the imperial forces. She had watched thousands of her followers die fighting for freedom while she escaped like a coward. Now she was ready to face whatever punishment awaited her, but she begged Pete not to let her people's sacrifice be forgotten by the galaxy. Pete felt tears in his eyes as he listened to her story. This was not some terrorist or criminal. This was a person who had given up everything to fight against evil and protect the innocent. She reminded him of the heroes from human history who had stood up to tyrants and bullies, even when they knew they would probably die for it. When Pete returned to the briefing room, the debate was still raging. Dr. Carter and Lieutenant Walsh had joined Commander Brooks in arguing for surrendering the princess. They pointed out that keeping her would not save her people or stop the Zephyrian Empire. It would just get everyone killed for nothing. Captain Harrison sat quietly listening to both sides and trying to make an impossible decision. Pete described his conversation with the princess and how she had accepted her fate with dignity. But he also reminded the crew that humans had always prided themselves on standing up for what was right, even when it was dangerous. If they abandoned someone who had fought against the same evil they faced, what did that say about human character and values? That the argument continued for hours while the deadline approached. Captain Harrison finally made his decision based on cold military logic rather than moral principles. The UES Horizon would comply with the Council's ultimatum and surrender Princess Kiravel to the Zephyrian authorities. Pete was the only crew member who voted against the plan. As preparations began for the handover, Pete felt something die inside his chest. He had always believed that humans were different from other species because they cared about justice and protecting the weak. Now he learned that when things got really dangerous, most people would choose safety over doing what was right. The princess would face torture and death alone while her supposed rescuers sailed away to safety. The Zephyrian battle fleet arrived exactly on schedule, like a storm of metal and death against the star field. Pete Morgan watched from the engine room monitors as 12 massive warships took positions around the UES horizon. Each enemy vessel was 3 times larger than their diplomatic ship and bristled with weapons that could turn them into space dust in seconds. Harrison opened communications with the lead Zephyrian ship. The alien commander who appeared on screen had the same blue skin as Princess Kiravel, but his bioluminescent markings pulsed with angry red colors. He identified himself as Prince Vextor, older brother to the rebel princess they were harboring. His voice carried the cold authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. Pete monitored the communication channels from his engineering station and noticed something strange. The Zephyrian ships were using encrypted tactical frequencies. That should have been blocked during diplomatic talks. He ran the signals through the ship's analysis computer and felt his blood turn cold when he saw the results. The aliens were coordinating attack patterns and target assignments. Commander Brooks escorted Princess Kiravel from the medical bay to the shuttle bay where the transfer would take place. She walked slowly because of her injuries, but kept her head high with royal dignity. Dr. Carter had protested moving her so soon, but the Zephyrians refused to allow any delays. The princess wore simple human clothing since her royal garments had been destroyed during her escape. Pete tried to contact Captain Harrison through the internal communication system, but found that someone had locked him out of the command frequencies. When he attempted to leave the engine room, security guards blocked his path. Commander Brooks had apparently decided that Pete was emotionally compromised and might try to interfere with the handover. He was confined to his duty station until the transfer was complete. The young engineer felt desperate as he watched the tactical displays showing Zephyrian soldiers boarding the horizon. According to the intercepts he had decoded, the aliens planned to kill everyone aboard once they had the princess safely in custody. The whole diplomatic handover was just a trap to eliminate witnesses who might tell other species about Zephyrian treachery. Pete used his engineering access codes to override the security lockout on his door. The corridor outside was empty since most of the crew was either at their stations or watching the transfer ceremony. He made his way through maintenance passages toward the shuttle bay while trying to think of some way to warn everyone about the coming betrayal dot in the shuttle bay. Princess Kiraval stood between two human guards while Zephyrian soldiers formed a circle around them. Prince Vextor had come aboard personally to collect his sister, and his presence filled the room with menace. He wore elaborate military armor that gleamed with embedded weapons and showed off his high rank in the Imperial forces. The prince walked slowly around his sister like a predator circling wounded prey. He spoke in the Zephyrian language, but his tone needed no translation. He was enjoying her capture and the fear he saw in human eyes. Captain Harrison stood nearby, trying to maintain diplomatic protocol while surrounded by heavily armed aliens, who clearly had no respect for his authority. Pete reached a maintenance hatch that opened near the shuttle bay and carefully peered through the grating. He could see the transfer ceremony, but was too far away to do anything useful. The Zephyrian soldiers had positioned themselves to control all the exits, while more of their troops spread throughout the ship. The situation was hopeless, but he refused to give up. Prince Vextor finally spoke in human language so everyone could understand his words. He thanked Captain Harrison for cooperating with the Council's ultimatum and promised that this act of good faith would be remembered when the Empire decided humanity's final fate. The way he said it made clear that humans had no future in his plans for the galaxy. The princess looked directly at Pete's hiding place as if she somehow knew he was there. Her golden eyes were sad, but not afraid as she prepared to face whatever torture awaited her. She had made peace with her choices and accepted the consequences. Pete felt ashamed that he was hiding like a coward while she faced death with such courage. Suddenly, alarms began sounding throughout the ship as Zephyrian troops started shooting human crew members in other sections. The diplomatic ceremony had been a distraction while soldiers took control of vital systems. Captain Harrison demanded an explanation, but Prince Vextor just smiled and drew his sidearm. The betrayal was now complete and obvious. Pete kicked open the maintenance hatch and dropped into the shuttle bay, shouting a warning to everyone present. The human guards spun toward him in confusion, while several Zephyrian soldiers raised their weapons. In the chaos that followed, Princess Kiravel broke free from her captors and ran toward a maintenance shuttle parked in the corner of the bay. Commander Brooks tried to draw his weapon, but Prince Vextor shot him in the chest before he could clear the holster. The security chief fell to the deck with smoke rising from the energy wound, while other Zephyrian soldiers began systematically killing the remaining humans. Captain Harrison managed to activate the ship's emergency broadcast before taking 3 shots to the back. Pete reached the maintenance shuttle just as Princess Kiravel got the engines started. She had apparently studied human technology during her recovery and knew enough to operate basic controls. He jumped through the closing hatches. Energy bolts from Zephyrian weapons scorched the hull around him. The small craft lurched forward and shot out of the bay into open space. Behind them, the UE's horizon exploded in a ball of fire and debris as the Zephyrian warships opened fire with their main batteries. Pete watched through the rear viewport as his home for the past 2 years disappeared forever, along with everyone he had served beside. Dr. Carter and Lieutenant Walsh were dead along with the rest of the crew, who had trusted their enemies. The maintenance shuttle was not designed for long-range travel and had limited life support systems. Pete ran diagnostics on their supplies and calculated they had maybe 6 hours of air if they were careful. The Zephyrian fleet was already launching fighter craft to hunt them down, and their small ship had no weapons or shields to defend itself. Princess T. Ravel piloted the shuttle through an asteroid field, hoping to lose their pursuers among the floating rocks. She flew with skill that impressed Pete, even though he could see she was exhausted from her injuries. When he tried to take over the controls, she shook her head and said this was her fight now. She would not let anyone else die because of her. Found a hiding place inside a hollow asteroid and shut down all systems except minimal life support. In the darkness, Pete finally had a chance to talk with the alien princes he had risked everything to save. She thanked him for his courage, but said she was sorry that his sacrifice would probably be meaningless. The Zephyrian Empire would continue, crushing freedom wherever it found resistance. Pete told her about the intercepted communications he had decoded before the attack. The Zephyrians had never intended to honor any agreements with humanity or other species. They saw diplomacy as just another weapon to use against their enemies. Every treaty and ceasefire was just a way to buy time while they prepared for the next attack. The princess was not surprised to learn about her brother's treachery. She explained that Prince Vextor had always been their father's favorite son, because he enjoyed inflicting pain on weaker beings. He had personally supervised the construction of concentration camps and had invented new torture methods for breaking rebel prisoners. He represented everything evil about their empire. As they sat in the cold darkness waiting for their air to run out, Pete asked why she had chosen to fight against her own family. The princess was quiet for a long time before answering. She said that growing up in the palace had shown her how power corrupted people and turned them into monsters. She could have lived in luxury forever by ignoring the suffering around her, but she chose to see the truth instead. She told Pete about secret trips she had made to lower caste districts, where she saw how the other half of her people lived. Children worked 16-hour days in factories that produced weapons for the Imperial fleet. Families were separated when parents were sent to labor camps for minor violations of caste laws. Anyone who complained or tried to organize better conditions simply disappeared in the night. The princess had used her royal access to gather evidence of these crimes and tried to present it to her father. Emperor Zexkun had laughed at her concerns and said that lower castes existed to serve their betters. When she continued pressing for reforms, he had her confined to the palace and threatened to have her declared mentally unstable. That was when she decided that the system could not be changed from within. Pete listened to her story and felt amazed by her moral courage. She had given up everything, including her family relationships, to fight for people who could not fight for themselves. Most humans he knew would not risk their comfortable lives to help strangers from their own species, much less aliens they had never met. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of engines outside their hiding place. Zephyrian fighters had found their asteroid and were preparing to blast it apart. Pete and the princes looked at each other, knowing their brief escape was about to end. The explosion that Pete and Princess Kiravel expected never came. Instead, they heard different engines approaching their asteroid hiding place and an unfamiliar voice speaking human English over the radio. The speaker identified himself as Captain Ben Foster, commanding the cargo ship Lucky Strike. He had monitored the Zephyrian attack on the UES horizon and was offering rescue to any survivors. Pete was suspicious of the offer since it seemed too convenient, but their air supply was running dangerously low. Princess Kiravel made the decision to trust the unknown human and activated their emergency beacon. Within minutes, a battered old freighter appeared outside their asteroid and extended a docking tube to their maintenance shuttle. Captain Foster turned out to be a grizzled man in his 60s, with scars on his face and arms that told stories of a hard life among the stars. His crew was a mix of humans and aliens from species that Pete had never seen before. They moved with the careful efficiency of people who had learned to trust each other completely in dangerous situations. The Lucky Strike looked like junk from the outside, but Pete quickly discovered that appearances were deceiving. The ship's engines were military grade, and its sensors were more advanced than anything the diplomatic service used. Hidden weapon pods could extend from the hull at a moment's notice. This was not just a cargo hauler, but a warship disguised as a harmless trader. Foster led them to a meeting room where representatives from a dozen different alien species waited around a circular table. Pete recognized some of them from diplomatic files, but others belonged to races he had never encountered. What they all had in common were the hard expressions of people who had lost everything too. Zephyrian aggression and wanted revenge. The group called itself the Free Coalition and had been fighting a secret war against the Zephyrian Empire for over 20 years. They operated from hidden bases in remote systems and funded their activities by raiding enemy supply convoys. Most galactic governments refused to support them openly, but many provided weapons and intelligence through unofficial channels. Princess Kiravel's arrival electrified the resistance fighters because she possessed detailed knowledge of Imperial military installations and troop movements. More importantly, she carried encrypted data about her father's secret weapons, programs including a virus designed to target specific alien genetic markers. The bioweapon could potentially wipe out entire species, including humanity. Pete found himself thrust into planning sessions where former slaves worked alongside refugee scientists to design attacks on Zephyrian facilities. His engineering background proved valuable for sabotage missions that required precise timing and technical knowledge. The resistance fighters were impressed by his willingness to learn their methods despite having no military training. The princess spent hours briefing coalition leaders about conditions inside the Empire and potential weak points that could be exploited. She revealed that many lower caste Zephyrians secretly supported the rebellion, but were too afraid to act openly. With proper coordination, uprisings could be sparked across multiple worlds simultaneously. Captain Foster assigned Pete and the princess to work with a strike team led by a fierce alien warrior named Commander Vekra. Her species had been nearly extinct when the Zephyrians invaded their home system, but she had escaped with a handful of survivors who now formed an elite fighting unit. She taught Pete basic combat skills while learning about human tactics and technology. Their first mission together was to raid a Zephyrian research station where scientists were developing new versions of the genetic virus. Pete used his engineering knowledge to disable the facility's defenses, while Princess Kiravel guided them through the security system she remembered from her days in the palace. The raid was successful, but cost the lives of 3 coalition fighters. Pete felt sick watching good people die to stop an evil that seemed too big to defeat. Princess Kiravel comforted him by explaining that every small victory saved countless innocent lives, even if they could not see the immediate results. The research they had destroyed would have led to weapons capable of genocide on a galactic scale. As weeks passed, Pete learned more about the scope of Zephyrian crimes against other species. Entire civilizations had been enslaved or wiped out. To make room for imperial expansion, billions of beings lived in conditions that made death seem like mercy. The princess had been trying to expose these horrors, but her own government had branded her a traitor for caring about inferior races. The young human engineer began to understand why so many different species were willing to risk everything fighting the Empire. This was not just a political conflict, but a struggle between civilization and barbarism. The Zephyrians saw other life forms as resources to be exploited, rather than thinking beings with rights and dignity. Pete's relationship with Princess Kiravel deepened as they worked together on increasingly dangerous missions. She taught him about Zephyrian art and philosophy, while he shared human concepts of democracy and individual freedom. Despite coming from completely different worlds, they found common ground in their shared belief that all sentient beings deserved respect and protection. The princess was amazed by human ideas about government by consent of the governed. Zephyrian society had always been ruled by hereditary castes with the emperor's family at the top. The concept that ordinary people could choose their own leaders seemed impossible to most of her species, but she began to see it as the key to breaking the cycle of oppression. Their growing partnership became a symbol of what the coalition was fighting to achieve. Representatives from dozens of species worked together despite their differences because they shared common enemies and values. Pete realized that his decision to save one alien princess had connected him to a galactic community he never knew existed. The coalition's activities began attracting serious attention from Imperial forces. Prince Vextor arrived in the sector with a massive fleet and started systematically destroying any world suspected of harboring rebels. His tactics were brutal, even by Zephyrian standards, as he ordered the bombing of civilian targets to terrorize local populations into submission. Captain Foster called an emergency meeting of coalition leaders to discuss the response to the new threat. Intelligence reports indicated that Prince Vextor was using the search for his sister as an excuse to implement his father's final solution for dealing with inferior species. Concentration camps were being built on conquered worlds to hold populations. Before they were exterminated, Pete listened to the briefings and felt overwhelmed by the scale of suffering that was planned. Billions of innocent beings would die unless someone found a way to stop the Imperial war machine. The coalition had been fighting for decades, but they were still just a small force compared to the Empire's military might. Princess Kiravel stood up during the meeting and announced that she had an idea that might change everything. She had remembered something from her childhood about an ancient alien installation called the Nexus that contained technology from a vanished civilization. Her father had sent expeditions to find it, but they had all failed because the location was hidden in old texts that only she could read. The princess explained that the Nexus was supposed to be a weapon of incredible power, but it could only be activated by representatives from multiple species working together in harmony. The builders had designed it that way to prevent any single race from using it for conquest. If the coalition could find and activate the installation, they might finally have a way to defeat the Empire. Pete felt a surge of hope as he listened to her proposal. This was the kind of desperate gamble that could either save the galaxy or get them all killed. But sitting in that room surrounded by beings from dozens of worlds who had all lost everything to Zephyrian brutality, he knew they had to try. Sometimes the only choice was between a dangerous hope and certain defeat. Captain Foster agreed to provide ships for the expedition, while Commander Thekra volunteered her warriors as security. Other coalition members contributed specialists and equipment for what would be their most ambitious mission yet. Pete and Princess Kiravel would lead the search team to find the Nexus before Prince Vextor could stop them. As they prepared for departure, Pete reflected on how much his life had changed since that day when they found a dying alien princess in an escape pod. He had started as a simple engineer who just wanted to do his job and avoid trouble. Now he was helping to plan an operation that could determine the fate of the entire galaxy. Sometimes one person's moral courage really could change the course of history. The journey to find the Nexus took the coalition fleet through regions of space that had been unexplored for thousands of years. Pete Morgan stood on the bridge of the Lucky Strike, watching ancient star charts that Princess Kiravel had decoded from forgotten Zephyrian texts. The coordinates led them to a system where 3 dying suns cast eerie shadows across a cluster of dead worlds. Captain Foster's sensors detected massive energy readings from the 4th planet, even though it appeared lifeless from a distance. As they approached, the true scope of the alien installation became clear. The Nexus was not just a building, but an entire artificial world covered with crystalline structures that pulsed with inner light. It had been waiting in silence for eons for someone worthy to claim its power dot. Princess Kiravel studied the alien. Writings carved into the entry portal and translated them for the assembled representatives. The ancient builders had called themselves the Harmony and had created the Nexus as a test for younger civilizations. Only species that could work together despite their differences would be able to unlock the installation's secrets and inherit its technology. Pete felt awed by the sophistication of the alien architecture as they explored the vast corridors inside the Nexus. Every surface was covered with equations and diagrams that seemed to describe the fundamental forces of the universe. The princess explained that her people's legends claimed the Harmony had transcended physical existence, but left their knowledge behind for others to find. The central chamber contained a complex control system that required genetic material from representatives of multiple species to activate. Pete watched as volunteers from over 30 different races placed their hands on crystalline interfaces that analyzed their DNA and confirmed their intent. The machine was designed to reject anyone who harbored thoughts of conquest or domination. Outside the installation, Prince Vextor's fleet had finally tracked them down and taken positions around the planet. The Zephyrian prince broadcast demands for his sister's surrender, while his warships powered up their weapon systems. He had brought enough firepower to crack the planet's crust, if necessary, to prevent the rebels from claiming the ancient technology. Pete and Princess Kiravel worked frantically with coalition scientists to understand the Nexus control systems before the enemy attack began. The installation's defenses had been dormant for millennia, but automated systems were beginning to come online as the activation sequence progressed. Energy fields started forming around the planet that could potentially deflect incoming attacks. Prince Vextor grew impatient with the delay and ordered his fleet to begin bombardment.